And why did you want to do it as an oral history? As you said, you are a reporter. You tend to write your own stuff. You use your own words. So what was it about this day that you felt like I gotta change the form?
I think this is obviously a story that's had a lot of changing narratives and a lot of people who are sort of trying to create narratives around it. And so for me, it's kind of almost like a bit of a foolproof way to get that history out there in the words of the people who were there and witnessed it without, it's not my narrative. It's not somebody else's narrative. It's not partisan. It's really just like the words of the, more than 150 people who were there.
Welcome to The Stacks, a podcast about books and the people who read them. I'm your host, Tracy Thomas, and today I am joined by Associated Press reporter Mary Clare Jalonick to discuss her new book, Storm at the Capitol, An Oral History of January 6th. In this book, Mary Clare Jalonick, who was on the scene that day, offers a comprehensive retelling of the January 6th, 2021 insurrection through the first-hand accounts of rioters, police officers, lawmakers, and those who were forced to flee the violence. Mary Clare shares with me why she wanted to tell this story via oral history, what details she was hoping to bring to light, and how her experience on the ground informed this story. Our book club pick for January is Girl on Girl, How Pop Culture Turned a Generation of Women Against Themselves by Sophie Gilbert, with Christiana Mbakwe Medina returning as our guest on January 28th. Everything we talk about on each episode of The Stacks is linked in our show notes. If you like what you hear today, if you want more bookish content or a community of readers to help you stay on track with all your reading goals this year, consider joining the Stacks Pack on Patreon and subscribing to my newsletter, Unstacked, on Substack. Each of these places offer different perks like bonus episodes, community conversations, hot takes on the latest literary and pop culture news, plus more. And your support makes it possible for me to make this podcast every single week. Head to patreon.com/thestacks to join the Stacks Pack and check out my newsletter at tracythomas.substack.com. All right, now it is time for my conversation about January 6th with Mary Clare Jalonick. All right, everybody, I am absolutely thrilled to be here today with Mary Clare Jalonick. She is the author of a brand new oral history called Storm at the Capitol, An Oral History of January 6th. I think the subtitle sort of gives away what the book is about. Mary Clare, welcome to The Stacks.
Thanks so much for having me.
I personally am a big fan of oral history. I feel like there could be so many more in the world. And last year we did a bonus episode with friend of the show, Garrett M. Graff, who is great oral historian. And he just casually mentioned, there's this like oral history of January 6th coming out next year. And I said, excuse me, what? And from that moment, I was committed to having this conversation today. So I am so happy that you're here.
Well, thank you so much. I heard that actually. I found it somewhere, and I was so honored that he mentioned that because he's obviously so good at it.
He's so
and
good.
Just kind of the master, the sort of modern master at doing that.
Let's sort of, I have so many questions for you, but before we dive in, for people who aren't familiar, will you sort of explain in 30 seconds or so what Storm at the Capitol is about?
Sure. It is it's sort of a collective history. It's an oral history of January 6th, 2021. And it's really sort of inside the building and outside the building that day. It includes lawmakers, police, workers, staff, journalists, and the writers themselves. Around, little less than half of the interviews are my own interviews. I'm a reporter for the Associated Press. I work in the Capitol. I was there that day, and I've been covering it pretty much ever since. So a lot of the interviews are my own, but then there's just like such a rich archive of interviews from court and congressional testimony and everything else, FBI interviews. So I use some of that as well to sort of fill it out and try to get as many perspectives as possible.
And why did you want to do it as an oral history? As you said, you are a reporter. You tend to write your own stuff. You use your own words. So what was it about this day that you felt like I gotta change the form?
Well, a couple things. I mean, I think this is obviously a story that's had a lot of changing narratives and a lot of people who are sort of trying to create narratives around it. And so for me, it's kind of almost like a bit of a foolproof way to get that history out there in the words of the people who were there and witnessed it without, it's not my narrative. It's not somebody else's narrative. It's not partisan. It's really just like the words of the, more than 150 people who were there. So it just seemed like a really good way to tell this story. Also, I had a lot of it. I'd just been doing so many interviews because I'd been covering it. And, a lot of the coverage centered around what was happening in the White House and Trump. But when I was doing those interviews and, even when I'm talking sometimes to people who nothing to do with January 6th, just anything else that I happen to be covering, I had just asked a lot of lawmakers about their experience on that day. And I always sort of tried to do that. And so I just had a lot of really good, we sort of call it like in our notebooks, I had a lot of stuff that I wasn't able to use just because it, you can only use so much. But so I really, I felt like there was a lot more that people didn't know, and a lot of little stories and a lot of anecdotes and just, things to sort of shed light on what happened.
How did you find the craft of oral history? How did you find this sort of form for yourself?
I loved it. I mean, I always have loved oral histories too. I have my husband is a big reader, and he's it's kind of funny. He was like, I don't really like oral histories. I think he likes mine. He's been very complimentary of it. But just when I was starting this process, he was sort of, kind of wasn't as, interested in that kind of reading that kind of book. But I have always really liked oral histories. I think they're really, I love reading them. And I just felt like I really like the organizational process of sort of putting everything together. I really enjoyed it. And, I didn't want to stop when I had to stop because we had to get the book out. But I feel like it's a different writing process because it's not like you write a chapter and you're done. The way the book came together was not at all like chronological in terms of the pages of the book. It's like, just sort of putting things in where they went in the timeline. Right. So, I could have added to it forever. So, right. I just really, I really enjoyed it. And I could double the size of the book if I had the chance.
Right.
So
I think that's what's so interesting is it's like, and I think Garrett said this to me, that it's a sort of a task of editing in a lot of ways of you are shaping and crafting this narrative. And I think while you're using people's words, you also as the author have a lot of control about what kind of story you're telling. And so I'm curious, what kind of story did you want to tell? What was important to you to make sure that people understood about this day 5 years later?
Well, I really wanted to, a lot of the details of the violence were important to me because that's something that's been disputed. And, a lot of these stories, if you go through the police officers when they're speaking in a very matter-of-fact way, whether it was in an interview or, in a court proceeding, and court proceedings can be pretty dry. I have colleagues who are covering the court cases, and they had these amazing databases of all of the cases that I really, that helped me a lot. But one of my colleagues said when I was sort of starting talking to him about it, he was like, a lot of this is really dry in court, like when they're, it's like legal language and that kind of thing. But when I got into the cases, I really didn't feel like that was the case. There was a lot of really dramatic things that these people were describing, and often, whether prompted by lawyers or not, we're talking about how they felt in the moment and how stressful it was. And in some cases, they brought in police officers in these trials. They brought in Secret Service. I could probably not get access to one of Mike Pence's Secret Service agents to interview. That would be hard. It would be really hard for me to get that interview. So the fact that they had that in the court case, it was a lot of people that I might not have been able to talk to, or police officers who wouldn't have maybe done a personal interview or who wouldn't have been authorized to do an interview. That was an issue in a lot of cases, but then they, of course, were, telling their stories in court. So I think those are stories that we might not have had access to if there hadn't been all of those records. So I thought that what I found, and there's so many, there are hundreds of cases. So I could still find more, I'm sure. There was just so much material.
Yeah. Do you feel like, you were there that day, and You mentioned that in the introduction. You sort of mentioned that again, like you have your own section at the end called like My Story, where you sort of share your experience of the day. And I'm wondering, like, what do you make of the way that January 6th has been covered, as we've just passed this 5-year anniversary?
Yeah, I mean, I work for AP and we're very straightforward. So it's like hard, but it's also really easy because, what we do is we just report the facts and what we know to be true. And so, we've sort of gone through covering it in that way. But it's definitely been interesting to see. I mean, the people that we're talking to in the Capitol, some definitely downplay it or, try to distort the facts of what happened or in more cases, like just ignore it, like it didn't happen. So, one thing that we found and that I think is interesting is while a lot of people do try to downplay it, I think there's a lot of interest in the subject. And, I think we saw that in the last week on the 5th anniversary. There was a lot of coverage of it and a lot of interest in it. And not also on Capitol Hill where they the Senate approved a plaque that the House was, trying to sort of not put up, even though they were supposed to. By law, it was a plaque that was going to honor the police who fought there that day. And it's been sitting in a basement, I think, for the last few years because Republicans in the House did not want to approve it. And I think that it shows that there is like a continuing interest in this story. There are, I do find that like people are kind of hungry for details about it.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that you do so well in the book that I really appreciated is, I'm here in California, and at the time, I have twins and they were born in December 2019. So in January 2021, as you talk about in the book, sort of deep COVID, I was trying to be a mom. And I remember that day, because it was kind of morning-ish for me. It was like after their morning nap. And was on the phone with my brother and I was like, oh, I'm going to take the boys to the park. And my brother was like, are you watching the news? And I was like, well, I had turned it on. I saw that they were like doing stuff. Like they were, like they were out protesting. And he was like, you need to turn on the news. And I was like, okay. And by the time I finally like sat down to turn on the news, we did not go to the park that day. Oh, wow. I think that like I was so confused and like didn't really, I don't know. And like the images I was seeing didn't feel like what I read in your book, like what you were talking about, the details and the violence. Like if you had asked me a week ago before I finished your book, how violent on a scale of 1 to 10 that day was, I probably would have been like, I don't know, 4 or 5. Like they definitely were like breaking the building and they were climbing. And like, I know there was a lot of like tear gas going on, but some of the like descriptions of the hand-to-hand combat and like how much that came up, I have no memory of that whatsoever, even watching live on television. Like I remember the QAnon shaman's picture. Like I remember some of those still images and some of the, video clips you talk about in the book that journalists in the building had captured. Like I remember some of that, but so much of what was happening outside the Capitol felt completely sort of fresh to me in a lot of ways, or like the details felt so new. And so I think one of the things that's really like incredible about this book is you have captured that day in a way that I think, many people maybe have forgotten. Because I went out to dinner with some friends after I started the book and I asked them on a scale of 1 to 10. And one person said 7 and one person said 5. And I think I said 3, maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4. Like I just didn't remember that. So I'm curious, like, if you were sort of hoping to kind of, like, if there were things you were hoping to make sure were entered kind of in the public memory again about this day.
No, I think that's so true. I think that's a really common experience. I had another reporter on Capitol Hill who is actually younger and who wasn't around then. And someone who's extremely plugged in and extremely smart and works in the Capitol. And said to me, I had no idea how violent it was. I think that that's true of a lot of people for lots of reasons. I think because a lot of people haven't, a lot of people still find it really painful to talk about who were sort of involved in that. And I think just a combination of, people not feeling comfortable speaking out for political reasons. There has been a lot of backlash to the officers who have spoken out. And, they get called liars and they get, targeted in all sorts of ways. So I think a lot of other officers have no interest in becoming public like that, or maybe aren't authorized to. So I think a lot of those stories did come out in court, but, there's only so much, there's so many cases, there's only so much that, detail that's going to come out in just in the public sphere without like going and reading all those court records. So yeah, I mean, and I think also when you're talking about that day, I mean, we didn't know how violent it was either. I didn't know how violent it was. I would say a couple days later. I knew it was bad, obviously, but really the videos of all the violence outside. And I guess what I would say to anyone who is surprised at how violent it was too is one other way to sort of, read the book for sure. Not to downplay that, but also, Google or, search on the internet, some of the videos from that day. There's so many videos. There's a huge video archive, a lot of it filmed by the rioters themselves, of what happened in so many different places. There really is a lot of evidence of that, but I'm not sure how often that's being, aired or if people have seen it. So I think that's a really common experience. And for me, I didn't realize it for, a couple of days until that stuff sort of slowly started coming out. And then congressional investigations brought a lot of it out as well.
Yeah, I think that was really stunning to me. And then also, and I want to get your take on this, because one of the things that I felt was so shocking in this book was like how long the House and the Senate and everybody like stayed in the building.
Yeah.
Like what? I think I'm naive in some ways, even though I'm pretty cynical in general, that like I just assume that people in charge have more information than me, like that people in charge just know. Like I just assume that the Capitol Police and like the DC, like Metro Police, they just like were prepared for this day. And I assume that as people are marching towards the Capitol and like pushing through barriers, that they're like, hey guys, we should go. But that very much is not what happened that day. Yeah. And we get this harrowing scene of which, you were a part of, though you're not a part of the book, which I do want to talk about later, but like that you experienced, where they have the House of Representatives and everyone in that chamber like putting on gas masks and like ushering them out as people are banging down the doors. And just why was everyone in there for so long? Why didn't they say, hey, let's just evacuate? We have these tunnels, like better safe than sorry.
Yeah, I mean, extremely good question. There were a lot of security failures that day, obviously. It's you're not naive. I mean, that's crazy. Like, it's so wild that they were still in session. When the rioters had already gotten in, they were right outside the Senate, and like almost the entire Senate was still in the building. I mean, in the chamber, listening to it right on the other side of the doors, people screaming and yelling and hoping to get in. And that's actually really unusual because the two sides had split to debate the Arizona electoral votes. And that was like part of the process because there had been objections. But usually like the entire Senate is not in the Senate and the entire House is not in the House. Like that's pretty just the way a normal day goes. Votes take a while. People go in and out. And when there's not a vote, there's almost no one in there. So for like the entire Senate to be in the Senate, it was all but like maybe 10 of them is wild. And like that for that to be happening in that moment. The Senate got out, moved a little more quickly because they were already in the building on the Senate side. But yeah, the House actually went back into session at one point when there was like already people in the building. Yeah. And we had no idea. But I mean, yeah, it's really, it was a lot of just confusion. And a lot of it was because of a massive security failure. But also, I think, what they would say too is just that they would never imagine that something of that level would happen with that many people getting into the building so violently. It was definitely a failure of imagination as well. It is a pretty wild timeline. And yeah, it's hard to believe that it happened that way.
And the other piece of that I guess I have questions about, and I don't know, maybe you don't have the answer, but one of the things that really stuck with me was like the police start putting out these calls to like, hey, we need more police. Like if you're around, come in or whatever. And then in the book, we get these quotes from different officers that sort of like, we showed up and we just like went to work. Mm-hmm. But was there not like an overreaching person in charge being like, hey, now that you're here, this is where you need to go. It just felt like people were just showing up and just like hopping into the fray. Is that really what was happening?
Yes, absolutely.
That's nuts.
Especially on the Capitol Police side of things.
Right.
There were a lot of people described just total chaos on the radio. There really weren't people giving commands. They locked down the building and they told them that. But people just, went where they thought people needed help. There were some people would call for help on the radio, and then people would hear that and go to that place. But it was all sort of up to each individual officer for the most part. And then they called, and that's the Capitol Police. And then they called in the Metropolitan Police, which is DC Police, was there within like 10 minutes of that call. And they really took over in a lot of places. Capitol Police was just understaffed. They hadn't had the intelligence to really warn their officers that all this was going to happen. Equipment was failing. We wrote about, not too long afterward, there were shields that were just breaking on impact because they were old. People didn't have the training for a lot of this. There were, one officer was saying she was like part of like the hard unit that was on the front lines, but her gear was like in a van somewhere. Right. So she couldn't access it. So, there were all sorts of failures like that, which they have spent the last 5 years, trying to improve.
Certainly hope so.
Yeah, they've done a lot. And also a lot of them, some of their testimony was that a lot of these people seemed to know what they were doing, and they seemed to have sort of a planned route in. There's a really good New York Times video essay that came out in 2021 at some point that I think is worth watching. They did a lot of really good. They did a lot of really good like video essays that year, sort of showing, or video essay might not be the right word, but video packages showing a lot of the footage that had been compiled and how people got in, and how some of it seemed to be planned from some of the extremist groups, sort of knew where to go, and exploited some of the holes in those police lines.
I'm going to find that New York Times video piece, and I'll link to it in the show notes as well, with everything we talked about. Let's take a quick break, and then I want to talk more about these rioters. Valentine's Day is upon us, and I've got love on the brain. Love for books, duh, of course. Hello. Did you forget what podcast you're listening to? I love bringing you all great reads, exclusive author interviews, and behind the scenes book gossip. But I can only do that with your support over on Patreon and Substack. Our Stacks Patreon community, also known as the Stacks Pack, is where you can go for book club meetups, a private, very active Discord, and a year-long mega reading challenge to help you achieve all your reading goals. Plus, you also get that monthly bonus episode. Now, over on the Substack, you can subscribe to my newsletter, Unstacked, where I keep the book conversations going. I also give you a healthy dose of sports and pop culture, definitely some hot takes happening over there. And again, that bonus episode. If you don't have a few dollars to spare, don't worry. There are free options on the Substack and the Patreon to get you a little extra Stacks magic. Making this podcast is a total team effort, and by supporting my Patreon and my Substack, you allow me to support my amazing team that makes the show possible every single week. So if you or your friends are looking to meet other book lovers and support this indie podcast, come hang out with me on Patreon, Substack, or both. I would love to have you. And since we're talking about love, you can gift subscriptions to the Patreon and the Substack for that special reader in your life. For the Stacks Pack, head to patreon.com/thestacks. And for the newsletter, head to tracythomas.substack.com. And also, there are links to both in the show notes. Okay, see you in the Stacks. Okay, we're back. And you mentioned before that, and this comes up in the book a lot, that the police sort of felt like this was a coordinated attack, or these people knew what they were doing, whether they were former military or police themselves, just that they had a sense. And in reading the book, it felt pretty difficult for me to believe that this is like a spontaneous event that happened just because Donald Trump said, we're going to go to the Capitol, and that all of a sudden all of these people go and they're like pushing through barriers and attacking the Capitol in this way. Is there like legitimate evidence or like is there anything that points to like this being a much more coordinated attack, that these groups were working together, had a plan, and that obviously some people get swept up in the moment, you think you're just going with everybody else, but that there were people on the ground there who were like, we're going to go into the Capitol, we're going to try to fuck shit up? Like, what was the real, who was in charge here, I guess is the question.
I don't think anyone was in charge, but I think that that's true. I think there was a real and like one thing that I found definitely, and you know, I think that we've seen in terms of the writers who have talked about their experiences. There was such a diversity of people there, of motivations there. I mean, there were definitely like the extremist groups who had like guns in Virginia in a hotel room just in case like civil war broke out. There were people who brought weapons. There were people who, you know, as we were saying, like definitely appeared to like be really tactically looking at how to get into this building. And there was tons of people planning this openly online, like that they were going to get into the building and stop it. And that was like part of the security failure, is that they should have, you know, they should have been better. Prepared. And seeing all of that, some did, but there just wasn't enough coordination on that. So, yeah, I mean, that definitely, but I do think there were some people that it was spontaneous. So I think that was really interesting to me, that there were so many different types of experiences there from the rioter standpoint. There's one man I interviewed for the book who I just found super interesting, Jason Riddle, who he actually tried to reject his pardon earlier this year. And he has spoken about, you know, his experience. And he went into the building. He was just like, he said he thought of it like a party. It was like euphoria for him. You know, he was a Trump supporter and he was going to rallies all the time. It was like what he did. And he said, I don't even think I believed in the lie, but it was just like, you know, something that I did is go to these rallies. And he, you know, ended up at the Capitol, and his friends said, I'm not going past this barrier, you know, but he was like, okay, I'm going to do it, you know. And so he just sort of went in by himself, and he ended up in the Senate parliamentarian's office, which was being ransacked. And I don't really think he ransacked it, except for that he like went and stole a wine, and then he started drinking. He stole a book, and he went outside, and he actually sold the book called Senate Procedure book to another rioter, and the other rioter told him that he'd just seen someone taken out of the building who appeared to be shot, which I assume was Ashley Babbitt, who was shot trying to get into the House side. And he said, after he said that, you know, he realized what he was doing was wrong, that he could get in a lot of trouble for it. And he said he just ran until he was in like, it looked like a different place. And so I thought that his experience was like, his interview was really interesting, because he like sort of described what he was feeling in the moment and why he did it. And also sort of like had some perspective on it.
I think, so as I mentioned, I was reading this kind of over the holidays. So I was talking about it with my family a lot, which I don't always do when I'm, you know, reading for the show. Like I don't always have an audience where I'm sitting in a room and they're like, what are you reading? What do you think? Yeah. You know, but there was conversation coming up about this book. And one of the questions that my brother asked, that my mom asked, was like, I thought that these people, Trump supporters, were pro-police. I thought that these people, you know, supported law and order. How could they have been the ones who were so aggressively violent with the police? And you definitely talk about that in the book, but I'm sure listeners today are probably have that same lingering question. Would you be able to sort of address that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such an amazing contradiction, right? And it was like, even to the point that some of the officers were saying, you know, I think it was like the writers were like bringing it up in the moment, saying, we support you. You just have to let us through. You know, you should be on our side. You know, you should agree with us. You should, you know, we know you are on our side, you know. And some of them probably were, in terms of like maybe thinking that the election had been stolen or whatever. Not that they weren't still fighting, you know, trying to push them away from the building. There certainly is like a conservative bent in a lot of police departments. And some of the officers I've interviewed have talked about that some of the officers who they were fighting with that day still do support Trump. But at the same time, yeah, it is such an interesting contradiction. And I think it really, some of the officers, I wrote a story a week ago for AP, you know, they're really still having a hard time with this. And we'll talk about it, that, people talk about how they support law enforcement, but then at the same time sort of just conveniently leave off this part. And one of the officers I interviewed in the book, it was interesting because I interviewed two MPD officers who actually kind of like told me the same story separately. I didn't mention either one to either of them, but sort of said they were comparing and contrasting fighting right-wing people and fighting people who are aligned with Antifa, and saying like, a lot of times the left-wing protesters will like throw something at you and then try to film you and say that, you're trying to attack people. But they said that the right-wing protesters will get in your face and really aren't scared. That's not anything indirect. It's like very much face-to-face. And that they're really, really nice to police until police get in the way of something that they want to do. Yeah. And then it kind of goes out the window. But they have talked too about how like, a lot of these protests, they're getting a lot of love, the right-wing protests, because people are supporting them. So yeah, that like, it's like such a wild contradiction that I think a lot of people are still reckoning with.
Yeah.
today.
One of the things you just touched on was something that also was like so clear in the book, was the entitlement of so many of the rioters, right? It's like when the police get in your way of what you want to do, all of a sudden it's a problem. Like, I love the police, love the police. And then you get in my way and it's like, no, babe, gotta go. Yeah. This is what I want. And I think that like sense of entitlement of like, this is like, I can't remember who said it, but someone that, is quoted as saying something along the lines of like, they wouldn't even I can't believe they were hitting us or spraying gas at us. They wouldn't even let us talk. And it's like, okay, but you're not talking. Like, let's be real. You're in the middle of a mob and you're breaking into the Capitol, and, you did talk. Your guy just had a big speech. You guys have been talking about Stop the Steal for months at this point, few months. And you have been allowed to talk. But the idea that like just some of the contortions of logic, I mean, I think that's like one of the things that is so special about oral history in general, is like you get to understand how a person can justify almost anything to themselves, whether it's an oral history of like ESPN or an oral history. Like, it's just the way that people reason with themselves and then reason with whoever they're talking to, whether it's you, the interviewer, or in court or whatever. But I found that to be just spectacular in this book.
Yeah, well, I was like really excited when I would find anything like that was sort of explaining those motivations of people. Especially, it was great to talk to people like Jason Riddle, who were, regretted it and had that perspective. But I also really wanted to have the perspective of people who were trying to explain what they were feeling in the moment and why. And I thought, that was really helpful when people would say things like, they were like, well, we're trying to get in the building and they're keeping us from doing that.
Right.
And we have the right to be in the building because we're American citizens. Obviously, no one has the right to break into a building like they did, especially violently and beating police. But, I think there was like this real sense, people really, really believed that the election had been stolen. And there was this sense that they had every right, as American citizens, to be in there and to try to, overturn this result that they really truly felt was, illegal.
Right. Some of, like you said, Jason Riddle sort of has changed his tune almost like immediately, in his telling in the book. What have you seen over the 5 years from people who were there who either have like doubled down, or people who maybe have changed their tune and then maybe come back after the pardons? Like, have you seen any movement from, 2021, 2022 to where we are now, 2025, 2026 about what happened?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of all over the place. I mean, I think a lot of people were, sort of emboldened by their pardons. Another writer who I interviewed, Pamela Hemphill, also had tried to reject her pardon, but she didn't really.
What does it mean to reject a pardon? They want to stay in jail?
You can't reject a pardon. Yeah, but it's not.
They want to stay. They want to keep it on their record.
Said they wanted to reject it. I think they were just trying to make a point. I don't think you can reject a pardon.
But the point is like, we did something bad and we want to own up to it.
We shouldn't be excused for it because we did do something wrong. But she was interesting because she didn't really come around for a few years. She was really defiant for several years. And it was only like a year or two ago that I'm trying to remember the exact story, and I don't think it's in the book. But I think maybe it was through therapy or so. I don't want to say it wrong, so I'm not sure. But she, sort of came to it a little later and sort of realized what she'd done was wrong. But then there's other people who were like contrite in court, but then clearly not contrite afterward. So and I think there has been like so much political movement on this, this sort of effort to defend the rioters and to downplay the violence has gained steam and really culminating right after Trump was elected. So I think people might have been, I can't speak to anyone specifically on that, but it does seem like, people have been sort of emboldened by that and have a lot of support from people who think that they were truly wronged for, being put in prison or being convicted or whatever, right. Might have been their consequence.
This is sort of going to be a weird tangent, but I think I can thread the needle. Something that I've noticed as a person who reads books online is that every year there's sort of like a classic book that I see a lot on the internet. Last year it was Frankenstein. Everybody was like, Frankenstein this, Frankenstein that, myself included. We did it for book club. It was the best book I read last year. I just loved it. And this year I keep seeing The Count of Monte Cristo. And as I've been thinking about like what's going on, why are people talking about this book? What could it be? And a friend of mine was like, I think revenge is going to be really big in 2026. And as soon as they said that to me, I was in the middle of your book. The next book I read was Fear and Fury by Heather Ann Thompson, which is about the Bernard Getz subway shooting in 1984. And I just can't help but think like maybe there's something to this idea of like, we are hungry as a country for revenge. And I don't know if that like speaks to you at all, but I just sort of want to bring it to you and open the floor.
I mean, Trump certainly said in his campaign that's what he wanted to do, and if he was reelected, and we've seen him do that on many levels. So, that's sort of what I think of when you're saying revenge, and that's totally fascinating. I think we're seeing that in so many ways from him this year, and how that all plays out, I'm not sure, but I think that's super fascinating. And that's, to an extent, sort of what we saw with the pardons and everything is, and also just like defending people who obviously were supporting him, but that's super interesting. I think we're
keep an eye on it this
year. We're trying to figure stuff out right now. I think there's things happening so quickly. And one of my favorite quotes in the whole book is from Manu Raju, who's a anchor and congressional correspondent for CNN. And I don't have it right in front of me, and I can get it and read it if you want. But it's basically talking about how we're still reckoning with this, and we're still finding out so many details about what happened that day, and that we didn't realize in the moment like how big this was going to be. And just like that sort of idea of it being kind of a dynamic thing that everyone is still figuring out. I think that's really interesting because like something like, and I don't want to compare this to 9/11 because obviously so many people died on 9/11. It was a huge, it's a different situation, but just talking about something big like that happened, like a big political thing that happens to our country. There were investigations and we did learn a lot as the years went on, but the basic facts were not in dispute. People understood what happened on that day. And I think a lot of people have a lot of dispute over the very most basic facts of the event. And that's like an unusual situation.
That's right. That comes up in the book of like, there's a moment in the House chamber where this is all going on and one of the congressmen is like, you guys did this. Like they're like fighting in the moment over sort of like the rhetoric. And, I think someone's like, your guy, this is your guy or something like that in reference to Trump. And I think like that part of this is also really fascinating of like the spin and the media interpretation and the ways, Ted Cruz has this fascinating leap of logic at the end of the book when they're back, the Senate has reconvened and he's giving like a pep talk to the other people in his camp because his camp was like, we're gonna dispute this and then we're gonna have to go to a debate, whatever. And he's like, this is what the protesters would want, is for us to not do this. So we've got to do it. And I'm like, no, babe, the protesters want you to do what you're doing. Like, it's just the ways that this story has been spun and how, you know, sort of like activist different people have been in this story is really an interesting thing to kind of watch in real time as, you know, an adult who is paying attention even a little bit of like, whoa, Trump called them tourists? Like, what are we doing here? And that, you know, you're a journalist, that like he gets away with it, right? Like that it's reported as such.
I think people are testing like every day the boundaries of what people will believe. And I think sometimes they find that people will believe it. So I included at the end sort of some of the things that people have been saying about it. And one was just a year ago on January 6th, 2025, a congressman, Mike Collins, put on Twitter, you know, it was like, it was peaceful grandmothers who came, and, you know, and, you know, albeit unauthorized visit, you know, and, you know, really sort of like, it's almost like a troll, you know, I don't know what his motivation was. But it is really interesting, like just this sort of effort to say, no, this really was peaceful and you've been completely misled on this. And there's a lot of people who are willing to believe that, and they're not necessarily seeing the video or hearing stories of the police officers or whatever. So, you know, I really, it's really important to me that this book was like straight down the line, and it really seemed, you know, that's my job too, is like not to have a partisan narrative or have a bias or a dramatic narrative that makes it seem like, you know, I have a point of view. My point of view is like, I just want the facts to be out there. And so that's really important to me, that people who might not believe this or might support Trump or whatever can read this and find it to be straightforward and, you know, not feel like, you know, this is some sort of narrative that they're being fed.
I sort of brought this up earlier, and I do want to ask you this quickly, which is, did you ever consider including your own story, your own voice as one of the voices in the book? And if so, what made you take it out?
I wasn't totally sure how to deal with that. I don't think I was ever going to like have it as like a blurb in with the other blurbs. That would just be weird. I don't know like how I would do that. I think originally we were thinking about maybe having more sections that have my story like interspersed, but it just seemed like that was too focused on me. Sure. Not only was that I'm an Associated Press reporter. I'm not used to having like my name out there or my, like, that's not, you know, we're sort of about like staying in the background and, having the story be the most important part. And so it is like weird for me, but also I just thought like narratively, and that's something that we discussed, like I discussed with my editor, was like trying to break it up with that would just like totally get in the way of the story. Yeah. So we kind of, and I actually cut it quite a bit at the end too. Cause I think it was a little bit longer than it was, but it was just sort of like, okay, we already know all the facts of what happened. We don't need like a whole nother long story about somebody's day. So, we sort of made it shorter in the end, which I think worked better. I was trying to reconcile too. Like I had an interesting experience, but I didn't, I wanted to focus more on like the police officers and, lawmakers and people who were not me. But yeah, so that really was a discussion, and I wasn't sure how to do that. My husband was also there that day. And
I was curious if he was going to be in the book too. When
do I put him in as like as like one of the voices, and like we didn't really end up doing it because I thought it would be strange, but I did mention him, I talked about his experience in my narrative. So yeah, that was definitely a discussion about like, but I'm always most comfortable taking myself out of it as much as possible. But I also felt like it was important to like have that, at least, tell my story a little bit.
Yeah. So something I always ask folks about here is, how do you like to write? How many hours a day? How often? Music or no? In the home, out of the home, snacks, beverages, rituals? Kind of set the scene for us.
This is such a fun question because it's like, it seems like chaos. I'm really busy. I have my job. My day job is extremely busy. I have 2 kids who are now teenagers. It is like, I wrote a lot or, compiled and wrote a lot of this book in the middle of the night, basically. Right. A lot of it was really late. And when I was on book leave, which I took for a few months and was not long enough, I was literally how little sleep can I get and survive? And that's what I'm going to do. So I am, which I've always been able to sort of not sleep. That's just how I am. I can function on little sleep. I'm really looking forward to getting more sleep this year. But yeah, no, I mean, it's very much sort of like at my kitchen counter, just really and I was talking this with a friend of mine the other day too, like how different people are when they're writing. And for me, it's very much like just bursts. And then I just go into like total focus. And sometimes I'm not really even thinking about what I'm doing. I'm just doing it. And music, yes, I love listening to it. That's actually something we discussed with my colleagues too, is I don't know, since I was a teenager doing homework, I've always I can get more motivated when I'm listening to music. It just sort of like keeps me
What kind of music?
Focused. Oh, I don't know. Well, I sometimes classical, like when I'm really in the zone, like classical music, because you can't have anything that's going to distract you.
Okay.
But generally also just like energetic music, like sometimes like pop, like just anything that's like getting me I don't know. It's so weird. It's funny. Like some people can't even imagine doing that. But yeah, just I don't know. It's like, it gives me adrenaline or something. I don't know. But I definitely listen. I had some late nights listening to I think when you see your Spotify rap,
yeah,
there were a couple of classical pieces that were on there. Cause I listened and that's what it was on Spotify rap. There were this one day and it was a night that I think I had stayed up all night writing. And it was you listen to this one piece of music, which was a classical piece of music, 17 times in a row. It was and it was oh, that is just traumatic to look at. But yeah, it was really interesting. But also doing this, I was able to listen to music a little bit less because so much of it was listening to recordings of interviews and trying to transcribe. So that, got in the way a little bit of the music part.
And you didn't answer this part of the question, but I have to follow up, which is snacks and beverages.
Oh, I drink a lot of Diet Coke.
Me too.
Not that proud of it, but
oh no, we're very Diet Coke friendly here at this podcast.
Sporadically, yes, but nothing that is that I would remember or say. One thing I did do, especially in this period, finishing it was just a lot of coffee and
black coffee.
No, it was a latte that I would get. Okay. I'd drop my son off at school in the morning and get a venti from Starbucks. It's so bad. I can't live telling this story.
This is not bad. I just want you to know I've gotten way more intense answers. Okay. This
get
is
a venti from Starbucks and then just drink it all day and save some of it until the evening, because I knew if I had the rest of it in the evening, that would help me stay up.
Stay up. That's amazing.
But that was in the real crunch period. I don't do that anymore, but,
there's no shame. There's no shame.
What can you do to stay up as long as I can? Because I knew, because again, with the oral history format, it was the more stuff I can get in there, the better it's going to be.
Right.
And I only have this much time to finish. I've been working on it for years, but when I was really just finishing it, there was always just so much more I wanted to tell, so many more stories I wanted to tell. And so, just the more time I was awake and working on it, the more voices I could get in the book, and the more, that was just really important to me to just get as many, good, some things didn't end up staying in there, but
is there anything,
just as many voices.
Is there anything that you remember specifically, that's not in the book that you wish could have been?
Yeah, there's definitely workers and Capitol Police in the building that I would have loved to have talked to, but are not authorized to talk about that. And I didn't want anyone to lose their job. So that was, I think there's a lot of stories that, and I don't want to, I think there's a lot of stories that are being told. And I was pleasantly surprised at how many people would talk about it. But I do think that there are still a lot of stories that haven't been told from people who, janitorial staff or, people like that who, really their supervisors in the Capitol, especially who now answer to Republicans, are never going to authorize them. And they don't have a lot of power in that situation, right? And so I certainly am in the Capitol. I could walk up and interview people and just ask them stories and maybe they would talk to me. But I really was important to me not to get anybody fired.
In trouble.
But I know story. There's a lot of stories that I've heard off the record from a variety of people. Up to many lawmakers that, that I'm not able to tell because it was off the record. So it just, I hope I sort of have like a dream of coming back to this at some point when people are talking about it more. I hope that people will talk about it more over the
10-year
years.
anniversary.
Yeah, maybe. When people feel politically that they can, if that does happen. Of course, memories get shorter in that time too, so it's not ideal. But I hope that more people do speak out about their experiences as time goes on.
I have a specific journalistic question for you, because I'm sure people listening also have this question. There is off the record, and then there is background, and then there is deep background. Can you just distinguish those things for us, since I have a real AP journalist right here in front of me?
Deep background doesn't mean anything. Like that's not, people will say that, but like,
people do say it though. I didn't make that up.
It's like background or off the record. There's no like different, there's no different grades of background. Like usually it's like whatever you work it out with the person, like what would you like me to do and say? And at AP, we have a lot of standards around that. Not everybody does, but we have really strict standards about you have to say why the person wouldn't talk. And you could never have a person on background and on the record in a story. So like if you see a person's, maybe in some publications, but in an AP story, if you see a person quoted, the person, and then there's another person whose background, that's not going to be that person who was quoted in the background quote. So, we try to only do that. It's definitely part of reporting, but we try to do it as responsibly as possible.
But what is background for people who don't understand the difference between those two things? It's okay.
That means that someone is allowing you to use what they're saying, but you can't use their name. So it might be, a person familiar with the meeting or whatever it might have been, a person who was there. And there was some discussion about doing that in the book with like workers or like, people who people who just generally felt like that they might be targeted if they talked out about it. And I didn't end up doing that, but there's a lot of people who didn't want their names associated with that. And we certainly find that in a lot of cases on the Hill, just because the politics are so tense.
Right. What's a word you can never spell correctly on the first try?
I know that there are words. I'm going to think of it afterward. But I will tell you that I feel like in some sort, it was maybe middle school, I misspelled the word system in a spelling bee and got eliminated on the first round. And I always, every time I see that word,
feel a little
I'm confronted by it. Yeah. I know there's many words in that category, but I just am drawing a blank right now. But I'm not a great speller, and my kids are unfortunately following in they're both really like to write, and they're both really nice writers. But they're both, I've had a lot of conferences about parent-teacher conferences where spelling was brought up. So
they'll be fine. You turned out great.
Yeah, they know they can still work out.
For people who love Storm at the Capitol, what are some other books that you might recommend to them that are in conversation with what you've done here?
Yeah, certainly all of Garrett Graff's oral histories are just so inspirational to me. Reading The Only Plane in the Sky, I read it and I listened to it. And there's also an audiobook of Storm at the Capitol, which is really cool. It had the actors doing the voices, which his did as well. And I read and listened to Only Plane in the Sky, and it is so powerful. It's different than this because it's also 9/11 was so huge, right? Yeah. Like it happened in so many different places. It's like the opposite, right? Where this is all about what happened in one place. And there's so many different theaters, and and there's so much archival material, so much. And he went through all of it. And I know you know all this because you've interviewed him, but just for listeners, it is such a powerful book. And it was something that, so I did listen to it. And I remember I listened to it after I read it, but I was listening to different parts, I think. And I was, on a road trip, and I listened to it for several hours in a row. And there was just a point where I was like, oh, I have to stop for a minute because it was so powerful. And, I lived through 9/11. I was, just starting out as a journalist in Washington. Just, it's such a power, and similar to what we're talking about here, there's so much I didn't remember or didn't, know. And just getting all of those voices, and it's just so bleak. And, hearing the things that people went through, and we know, and I think in a lot of ways haven't thought about because we didn't want to, because it was so awful. Hearing just having it there on paper, I think is so important, but it's also just it's hard. I think it's important to listen to, but it's also really hard. So, I mean, that would certainly be the most inspirational. And I have just bought his most recent oral history about the making of the atomic bomb, but I have not totally dug into it yet. I've been busy. But
there's no pressure to read anything around here. We're all busy. Okay, so go ahead.
I'll give you one more. Jamie Raskin's book. I was just sort of like thinking about the books that I've used sort of as research and inspiration. Jamie Raskin's book, Unthinkable, about it's also about January 6th and about his son died a week before by suicide, and he sort of talks about all of that. And he's a Democratic congressman from Maryland. He's actually my congressman. And he's a really good writer. And it's another really good look at January 6th, because he was one of the people who was sort of devising with Democrats how they might fight some of these challenges. So I would recommend that too.
He was one of my favorite figures in the book, actually. Last question. If you could have one person, dead or alive, read this book, who would you want it to be?
That's a really hard question. Can I dodge it a little bit and to say, like, I really would like, I think of people I know who don't believe that it was violent and think police officers are lying or whatever. I would like those people to read the book. And I would really hope that they would read it. I already know of at least one person in my life who is, and I would hope that they would read it and find it to be a straightforward account that they can believe, and that it sheds light and is also balanced enough that they don't feel like they're being, fed anything partisan or anything like that. And that would be my wish.
I love it so much. Everyone, this has been a wonderful conversation with Mary Clare Jalonick, the author of Storm at the Capitol, an oral history of January 6th. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
And everyone else, we will see you in the stacks. Thank you all so much for listening today, and thank you again to Mary Clare Jalonick for joining the show. And I'd like to say a huge thank you to Angie Messina for helping to make this episode possible. Our book club pick for January is Girl on Girl, How Pop Culture Turned a Generation of Women Against Themselves by Sophie Gilbert, and we will discuss the book on Wednesday, January 28th with Christiana Mbekwe Medina. If you love The Stacks and you want inside access to it, head to patreon.com/The Stacks to join the Stacks Pack, and check out my newsletter at tracythomas.substack.com. Make sure you are subscribed to The Stacks wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you're listening through Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please leave us a rating and a review. For more from The Stacks, you can follow us on social media at The Stacks Pod on Instagram, Threads, TikTok, and now YouTube. And you can check out our website at thestackspodcast.com. This episode of The Stacks was edited by Christian Duenas with production assistance from Sahara Clement. Additional support is provided by Cherie Marquez, and our theme music is from Tigirigis. The Stacks is created and produced by me, Tracy Thomas.